Okay, so picture this. You're putting together your investment portfolio, right? And you want it to line up with your values. Maybe you're really into renewable energy or making sure companies treat their workers fairly, all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You're feeling pretty good about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then you dig a little deeper and you find out some of these funds, you pick the ones that are all branded as like sustainable and responsible. Well, they're actually putting money into defense companies, even like straight up weapons manufacturers. Kind of
I
pose you for a loop, right?
It's definitely an interesting intersection, and it's one we've seen accelerating really rapidly, particularly in Europe, since the war in Ukraine began.
And we're talking a dramatic shift here,
Yeah.
right? Not just like a small uptick in defense investments.
Oh, absolutely. To give you a sense of the scale, at the beginning of 2022, European ESG funds held about 3.2 billion in defense stocks.
Wow.
By mid-2023, that number had more than doubled to 7.7 billion.
Wow, that's a pretty stark increase. So what's behind this huge change?
Well, the war in Ukraine has been a major catalyst. It's really forced a reassessment of what we even mean by defense in today's world.
Right. It's like, you buy home insurance thinking you're covered, and then bam, a massive storm hits that you never expected. And suddenly you're thinking, man, maybe I should have gotten more coverage.
Exactly. And governments, especially in Europe, are really emphasizing investment in their defense industries now. They're even going so far as to frame it as essential for sustainability.
Interesting. So their argument is basically no security, no sustainability.
Pretty much. They're saying you can't have a sustainable future if you're not even secure in the present.
Yeah.
And it's not just rhetoric either.
Right. They're actually putting some serious money behind it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We've seen the UK government, for example, come right out and say they support classifying certain defense investments as ESG friendly.
Okay. And they're not alone, are they?
Not at all. Even the Investment Association, which is a pretty influential group in the financial world, has echoed that sentiment. So, yeah, it's a pretty big shift in thinking for sure.
Well, that makes sense in a way, but it does kind of make you wonder, how do these ESG funds square this whole thing with investing in weapons, with, ethical investing? Doesn't seem like those two things really go together.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure, and it's something a lot of investors are really wrestling with right now. There's no simple answer, unfortunately. Different ESG funds are tackling this in a bunch of different ways.
Okay.
Some funds are drawing some hard lines, like with these exclusion lists. They have
Exclusion lists.
Yeah, basically they're saying certain things are just a no-go. For example, a fund might be like, nope, we absolutely will not invest in any company that makes controversial weapons. Things like cluster munitions or landmines, weapons that are known for having a really indiscriminate impact on civilians.
Right. Makes sense. So it's about setting those boundaries even within an industry that already has so many gray areas.
Exactly. And some funds even take it a step further. Like they might say, we're not touching any companies that are heavily involved in making civilian firearms. It really varies depending on where they decide to draw those ethical lines.
Huh. Interesting. So it's not really one size fits all when it comes to these ESG funds and their stance on defense.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And then you've got funds that use these geopolitical filters.
Geopolitical filters. Okay, now that's a new one on me. What's that all about?
So think of it this way. Some funds might only invest in defense companies that are based in NATO countries or countries that are considered close allies. It's almost like they're saying, sure, we'll invest in defense, but only for the good guys.
Oh, I see. But then again, who are the good guys? Exactly. That's a whole other can of worms right there.
Yeah, exactly. It gets super complicated super fast, and that's a big part of what makes this such a challenge for everyday investors.
Yeah, trying to keep up with all this while making sure your investments match your values sounds like a full-time job in itself.
You got that right. And that's why some funds are taking a more hands-on approach with something called engagement over exclusion.
Engagement over exclusion. So instead of just saying no to a whole industry, they're trying to work with them from the inside.
Yeah, they leverage their position as shareholders to try to push for change within those companies. They might advocate for stricter environmental practices during weapons production, better labor standards in the supply chain, maybe even encourage them to focus on developing less controversial defense technologies.
So it's more about trying to make those companies better rather than just giving them the boot completely.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that change doesn't happen overnight and that working with companies, even in tough industries like defense, can maybe help make things a little bit better.
So we've gone deep on the mechanics of how this whole ESG and defense thing works. But what does it actually mean for regular investors like us listening? If you're looking at ESG funds, should you be worried that you might be accidentally investing in weapons?
Yeah, and that's where it gets really, really tricky and where people have really strong opinions. There's no right answer, which makes it hard for investors. Even within the ESG community, there's tons of debate about where that line is.
So on the one hand, it's like you can't ignore what's happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
The war in Ukraine was a big wake-up call about security. And for some people, investing in defense companies is part of supporting that.
Right. It's like you can't really condemn the defense industry and then turn around and rely on it for protection when things get dicey.
But on the other hand, there are some really serious ethical questions about profiting from war in any way.
Absolutely. And you have to think about what kind of weapons we're talking about, too. A company making fighter jets isn't the same as one making landmines, for example.
So, like, where does an investor who wants to do good with their money even start with this whole thing?
Well, it really comes down to a few key questions. First, what are your hard limits? Are there any weapons or activities that are totally off the table for you as an investor? Second, how much transparency do you need from these ESG funds? Are they upfront about how they decide which defense companies to include? And finally, are you okay with this idea of engaging with defense companies to try to get them to be more responsible, or is divestment like the only option for now?
Sounds like there's a lot to think about here.
Definitely. And this is really just scratching the surface. We'd encourage you to do your own research, look into specific funds, what they believe in, and how they're dealing with this whole thing.
Totally. And on that note, let's go back to that portfolio we were talking about at the beginning, the one that's supposed to reflect what you care about. Now imagine you're the one making the decisions about which companies deserve a spot in that portfolio. If you were managing an ESG fund, where would you personally draw the line on defense investments and why? It's something to think about as you navigate this whole world of ethical investing. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.